Welcome back, everyone. You have made it to this session entitled Unlocking the Secret to SQF, your guide to risk-based food safety decision making. And our speaker today, well, she's the one, the only Denise Webster. And Denise is a food safety consultant and trainer from Food Brand Protection. And just so you know, this is not just an education session, but it is a live Q&A session. Plus, we have a post-session chat, a roundtable discussion where you'll be put into small groups to discuss a few different prompts that Denise is going to help us think about today. So listen, we're excited to knowledge share, to meet others, to ask questions. I want to see you in the chat. Take it away, Denise. We're here to learn.
Thank you, Rachel. Appreciate it. Okay, so as she said, we are here to unlock that secret code to SQF. Next. Well, we can keep moving forward here. So with today, I wanted to kind of craft up what are we going to cover? Well, we'll first start with what is a risk, where are they, and what is required to assess them. We'll then give you some tools for your toolbox. We'll put steps in place to help you develop a risk assessment, as well as we'll talk about this creation of a risk-aware team and give you some best practice industry examples to take home with you. And like Rachel said, we will open with Q&A. Next. So let's start with first aligning on this definition of risk. Risk is both a noun and a verb. The noun is a situation involving exposure to danger. That verb is the exposure to someone to that danger, harm, or loss. In this particular case, we could think about it as a non-conforming event where, say, a foreign material possibly entered the food stream. We have a situation that has occurred and that potential for danger for the consumer to obtain that product and potentially have an injury or illness if released. Risks are unfortunately vast in the food industry, as we learned from Sean earlier, or was reminded from Sean earlier this morning with those wonderful charts or not so wonderful charts. They start at the fields, like the golf balls he had mentioned that ended up in the hash browns. So not only did it then get into from the fields, it went in through our process line, and then ultimately ended up in the hands of consumers. Those potential impacts, as a reminder, could be those near misses, our product holds, our customer withdrawals, consumer recalls, such as those examples that he shared with us, and the unfortunate impact of potential outbreak, illness, or injury. It may be a lower risk, but still just as important, such as a customer complaint. We also have to ensure our regulatory challenges that could occur and litigation is managed. Ultimately, these potential impacts can have a negative impact on your brand. So truly our goal is, of course, to avoid risk altogether. But you can't resolve risk if you don't know what it is, where it comes from, or how significant its impact will be if not resolved. So let's take a look at where are these risks. Keep going. Well, risk really do happen in all areas of the supply chain, from those raw materials that we're getting internationally to domestic, to how we're processing it in our facility, the equipment we use, the finished product that we're making, to our employees that handle our product, and as well as ultimately how all of these come together to create an uncertainty and possible unpredictable outcomes. So our goal is truly to identify them proactively, develop strategies to prevent, eliminate, or significantly reduce their occurrence. You really have to ensure that, as the SQFI team stated yesterday, we need to conduct these risk assessments and let the code be our guide. Where should we perform risk assessments? Where do we have risk? And how do we ensure that we really understand the significance? SQFI gets the question a lot. How do I assess risk? Or what if I do this? Or how do I do that? Well, when it comes to looking at that code, it's important that we understand it, but we also look at our own process and determine yourself, where are those risks? Next. So if we just look at our SQF food manufacturing code, in that code, it's 106 times the term risk is mentioned. I think I might actually mention the term risk 100 times as well, and just in this presentation. And it's in those areas where you would expect. Our food safety plan, our product and process where we have to look at those hazard analysis, our good manufacturing practices and personal hygiene. But also it's important to remember we have those risks associated with those raw materials, our contract manufacturers and the contract service providers. We talked earlier today within the webinars around our environmental monitoring risk. If we don't understand the pathogens that could impact our environment and our overall products, then we're not really truly understanding the intent of the code. So where it might show up 100 times in the code, the goal here is that we really are creating a risk-based program. So how do we go about doing this? Next. Well, we must first start with a plan and a team. We can't do this alone, as well as tools for your toolbox. We have to understand our regulatory requirements, as well as the SQF code, obtain the data around our product and process. Are we ready to eat and not ready to eat? Do we have multiple lines, one line? We need to also look at how the industry has performed. Are there historical risks particular in that category? What does the CDC data say in the outbreaks? What are those triggers that could lead to something that we need to make sure we're controlling so we're not a statistic? We also have those other tools that we have already in our toolbox, our hazard analysis, our severity and likelihood risk charts, as well as, which we'll talk about later, our vulnerability and threat assessments. Next. So with our SQF website, obviously this is a vast resource, and they mentioned earlier around the guidance documents, but I also want to point out there is a risk assessment guidance. And within that, it's defined as the requirement for identification, evaluation, and estimation of the level of risk involved in a process to determine the appropriate control methods. So with this definition, there also is a process. And with anything, if we don't have a plan, a process of how to get there, it's difficult to be able to ensure the confidence in the controls and outcome that we have generated. So we have 4 steps that we'll cover to hopefully help you break this down. First step is to get your SQF practitioner, substitute, and those delegated qualified resources within your team. Make sure that you start to perform that structured approach. Understand how are you going to assess the risk of those particular hazards associated with all those key sections. And then you're going to determine the reasonable likelihood that that risk could occur. So we want to ensure that we then look at significance. So we need a tool to do this. Go to the next slide. This might look very familiar to most of you, or one version of the many that are out there. This risk matrix will help us look at the likelihood and probability of that perceived risk of whether or not it could actually occur. Is it unlikely to occur? Or is it likely based on history of your internal operation? Or there are recalls, for example, allergen labeling. We know that that is a likely risk that could occur. We might even say it's frequent, unfortunately, within the industry. These are areas that we need to assess. We then need to look at the severity of that potential recall. What could result in a potential control not being put at that place? What is the outcome? So we can use this risk assessment matrix much like we do in our everyday life as well. When we get into the car, we're looking at the risk of, do we have gas? Do we have a check engine light? We're taking risk when we back out of the driveway. We're looking in our rear view mirror or our camera. We're driving down the street. We have our own risk, and we have to determine how we're going to control those risks, as well as we have unknown risk. Those unknown risks, like my teenage son who is now out driving. So we have to also account for the other factors. And having this helpful tool and an approach will help us create those plans and really say what we do what we say, and then ultimately prove it. Next. So it might be helpful also to use other tools. So for example, not all risks are created equal. We have our food defense threat assessment, which is part requirement for the SQF code. And within that is to identify the potential deliberate acts of sabotage or terrorist-like incident within your facility. Although we need to make sure we're factoring also that interconnectedness of the code. 2.4.1 is food legislation, which means if you're an FDA regulated facility, you must also conduct a vulnerability assessment with what would be the intent. So if the intent of that potential sabotagee could be an insider attacker, and their goal would be to cause wide-scale public harm. So we need to also meet our regulatory obligations, but the nice thing is we can use those tools to drive that risk assessment. We can use the key activity types that you see here in the FDA's vulnerability assessment for food defense. Conversely, we also have our food fraud plan that we need to develop. We have to identify potential susceptibility of raw material or ingredient to substitution, mislabeling, dilution, or counterfeiting. How this differs is it's really due to economically motivated reasons. And we need to come up with a mitigation plan in place specifically for food fraud. This requires us to look at things a little differently when it's outlined in the risk assessment. We're going to look for our supply chain history, the complexity of that supply chain, even geopolitical considerations. As well as in this example, the pure vanilla extract, we're also looking at the cost. When there's a high demand for a product due to perhaps a weather condition or other contributing factors, is the risk of potential for food fraud there because of the nature of that economic motivated hazard? So when it comes to risk assessments, make sure you're looking at it from the standpoint of what you're assessing the risk on and use the tools that are out there and available. You don't have to create this from scratch. Next. So our second step is to interview your personnel. Your team is a great source of understanding where the risks are. Your maintenance team, your line operators, they know the history of the site, when things can go wrong. So yes, we have our internal team that's going to drive these assessments, but making sure that we're reaching out. We also maybe need to have those external smart experts out there, the SMEs. And we need to make sure that we pull in our contract service providers. Those chemical and pest control providers are a great resource. They truly are those subject matter experts that can help us understand if we have potential risks. They can also help us to establish mitigation plans and come up with ultimately the controls. So then we have step 3. Step 3 is we have to go ahead and develop and implement methods for those risks that are significant. Our defined plan that is documented, implemented, as well as that's properly communicated and trained will ultimately ensure that we're controlling those risks. And we want to create that risk-aware culture. That risk-aware culture, what do we mean by this? Next. So asking yourself, is your team risk-aware? Well, risk mitigation starts with your employees and as well as supported by management. If we take and look at our goal of creating this positive food safety culture with shared values, beliefs, and norms that affect mindset and behavior in, across, and throughout an organization, and we combine that with a team that's risk aware and has the capability of that same organization to recognize risks before they become a threat, communicate the issues, see something, say something, identify the mitigation steps before those issues occur, we can then truly create the potential for profound change and create this risk-aware culture. An organization where people know their risk, are comfortable discussing with management, and are willing to help resolve those risks and will really create that positive food safety culture growth that we are all aiming for to protect our food safety systems, and be able to show progress. Next. So our last step when we're developing this risk assessment for whatever particular topic we're looking at, we need to also remember that we understand where the risks are. We've gained the information to address them. We've developed these plans, but we have to communicate and monitor and review the effectiveness of them. We're going to create verification and monitoring activities in order to assess it. This is part of our plan, do, check, act cycle, where we're not just alone hoping that it works, that we're checking that it truly is working as intended. And if it's not, we go back through that cycle and we make sure that we adjust our plans as appropriate. Yesterday, we heard actually in the town hall that internal audits are one of the most common nonconformances, which to me, I felt disappointed to hear that still, because the power of that tool is that you get to be the auditor. You get to challenge your own programs to ensure they're truly working as intended, that you're reducing the risk every day within the operation. The goal is to make sure we review our documentation records, collect that data, look at it with different questions in mind, such as, are there trends of non-conforming issues? Is it something we need to address? Has there been our annual test been conducted? Are we doing what we say we're doing? This creates a risk if we've missed a check. We also want to make sure that if there are new hazards that arose either within your organization or externally within the industry, that we're bringing that into our plan, do, check, act cycle. Should there be something that we're doing proactively to ensure that it doesn't happen to us? And then are there any other changes that have occurred? Have we launched a new product, equipment, and we haven't just looked at our food safety plan? We've looked at those other supplemental supporting programs that exist within our food safety system. Next. We also have to remember not to forget, again, that internet connectiveness of the code that we're required to communicate to management, at least annually, of our hazard and risk management system. And then on a monthly basis, to show that we are doing that plan, do, check, act, the implementation and maintenance of the system, and we're communicating when we have issues. This perhaps might mean we need certain resources to address it. We need to ensure that we are communicating those risks and that we are putting additional controls in place as you need. Next. So let's take a look at this theory and put it into action. So if we take an element of the code, 2.8.1.5, it states that we must have a risk assessment for our procedures for validation and verification of the effectiveness of cleaning and sanitation. And for those of you that remember the code like I do, 2.8 is the allergen management section. This is where we need to make sure that allergens are effectively controlled within our cleaning and sanitation programs. So within this, we must ask ourselves questions. Those risks, what are they? They're going to be unique to your organization. So what is the risk you're controlling? What allergens of concern exist? And where could that potential allergen cross-contact occur? Do we have one type of allergen throughout the facility and cross-contact just doesn't exist? Or we might have wheat that is in all of our bread, but we have 1 or 2 SKUs that have soy. Well, we need to then develop a risk assessment and a plan to address the validation and verification activities specifically for cleaning those areas. We also have to address separation and scheduling further to control that potential for cross-contact. We have to also look at what are the risks of the equipment. Does it have the ability to be disassembled and cleaned? How will the steps be validated? Are we going to do an allergen-specific testing on the equipment? Are we going to test it? It's up to you. You have to determine those risks and then put those appropriate controls into place. That might also include your verification. Are we just going to do a visual inspection, or is it a significant enough risk that you should probably be doing some sort of indicator swabs or testing of some frequency? The goal is that your company identifies those risks, puts controls in place to address them, and continually monitors those for effectiveness. Next. So let's look at another risk assessment in action. We have our 11.1.2.5.6, where we must conduct a risk analysis on the mitigation of ducting, conduit, pipes, conveying ingredients, etc. This is a new section of the clause. And we have to ensure that, one, we identify whether or not this risk is even a risk within our operation. Do you have ducting, conduit, or pipes that transport wastewater over top of product lines? Do you have a complex network? Or perhaps maybe you don't have any pipes or ducting or conduit within your operation by those areas. And the issue here is that you won't have contamination, or the likelihood is very low. So you don't have that risk. There's no risk. Although you may have where we do convey inputs and outputs, and we have very complex. So it might just rank into a severity of low, medium, or high. You don't have to use that very complex risk matrix. Once we've determined the risk, we have to then prioritize and identify those controls. We also have to make sure that we document those controls, then implement them. We ensure that we have the training in place and the resources. If we said we're going to clean those pipe work that is above our line every month or every week, do we have a long enough device to clean it? Do we have a team that's trained to be able to clean that area? So we have to think about how to effectively implement where we have these risks and build this into that documented plan. Then we have to verify our effectiveness through our plan, do, check, continuous improvement cycle, ultimately ensuring that we really are controlling those risks. And when we have confidence that we are controlling those risks, we can truly prove to our auditor and ourselves that we are mitigating the hazards identified here. Next. Our last risk assessment in action is the clothing and hair policy that we know and love. I know a lot of my sites struggle with coming up with a risk assessment in this area. And my advice is all you need to do is show your work. You've already probably selected the perfect uniform with the no pockets, snaps, the elastic sleeves. Maybe you've got a color code for high risk versus low risk. You need to show your work. Why did you put those things into place? How did you go about considering it? Why are there color distinctions or no pockets above the waist? Well, we know that we're preventing potential unintentional microbial or physical contamination from entering the product stream. So when you're doing your risk analysis for your clothing and hair policy, which must be documented for compliance, factor in those two elements, the hair considerations as well as your uniform. Why would you have a full uniform versus perhaps your company issues a laundered t-shirt, or in the warehouse they can wear jewelry? Well, why is that? Go even further than just the clothing and hair. Really put that validation work together in terms of your risk assessment for your GMPs. Next. So how does this go about unlocking the SQF? Well, the importance of risk assessments are vital in effective development and implementation of our SQF code to truly be successful in our food safety systems. And we really need to create that risk-aware culture and have the documents to prove it. When we do this, our benefits are vast. We can protect product from food safety hazards, secure the facility, equipment, and processes from potential incoming risk. We can hopefully eliminate, reduce, and effectively manage them, as well as increase our SQF code compliance by having these documented, implemented, verified, and monitored risks and the controls in place, and ultimately to protect our customers, consumers, as well as our brand protection and trust of our consumers and within the industry. Next. So now we're going to open it up to questions.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much, Denise. That was really very good. Lots of good questions in my head. I'm seeing some good questions coming in from our attendees and our participants, and it's over on this screen over here. So pardon me while I turn my head slightly to look at that. Okay, all right. First question that I have for you is... It was right here. Can you talk about capability of an organization to recognize risk before it becomes a threat? Easy peasy question, but you're the woman to handle it. Go ahead, Denise. Give us your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think as you can see within the numbers, our capability needs improvement. I think we jump to looking at our food safety plan and having our food safety team, but do we have a risk aware team? And that's not just that core food safety team, right? And we're looking at all those elements. If there's a reason that it's 109 times in the code, it's because it is a risk-based code. And the purpose is that we understand where they're at and we put those mitigation controls in place and continually improve. So how do you do this? Well, you have to start shifting that food safety culture to also be risk aware and start engaging them on all levels, not just talking about the food safety plan.
Right. And a lot of it, I think, is understanding what's a risk, and just like you're saying, have that risk awareness, like is this important? Do we look at this? Is this something we run through our risk assessment tool and put together a matrix? I think that is one of the more challenging things to do. And maybe is that part of the culture? Is that building that risk mindset? What do you think?
I think so. And just like we've talked about do I need this program, or what should I do? It all really goes back to what are those potential hazards that exist within that particular operation, that product, that process, or that procedure. And that you're really spending time on that one topic and not trying to assess all the risk. It's just shocking to me that, we can have multiple hurdles in something and still end up with a recall. It's because if everyone doesn't realize why they need to do that step in the job, then we've kind of failed in our execution of that as well.
Good point. No job is too small. Everyone plays a role. And 2.9, training in your system elements is very important. Everybody gets trained on food safety for a reason, right? Or most everybody that comes in contact with the product gets trained in food safety for a reason, right? Everybody plays a role. And I guess that is then part of your culture, like you're saying, that you understand that your job is important and that you have a say. That's a very good point, Denise. Thanks for bringing that up. So something else, another question that we had, what is the best practice to communicate issues and identify mitigation steps before issues occur? So, a little bit more about this. How do you get people to communicate that, this seems important to me, from the person on the line all the way up to, purchasing. How do you build that communication channel? What are some of your thoughts on that, Denise?
Well, to be better at communicating than us about the poll that we need to launch. So
that was well timed.
Yes. So if we could launch that poll, and then I'll just answer that question. So yeah, we're good on that.
Yeah. So up at the top where you're chatting, you'll see it says polls. Click on that. I think you might be good at doing that by now, folks, but click on that poll. And the poll reads, Oops, I got to click on it so
Yeah,
I can
sorry,
see it.
I didn't
What
have
is the
it.
most challenging part of conducting a risk assessment? What do you find most challenging? Is it buy-in by the team that this is important, understanding the significance of risk, developing controls to identify or address the risk, and implementing the controls? Pardon me while I look off to this other screen here. So give us your thoughts on that. What do you find most challenging out there, folks? And then we'll see what you have to say about that.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing that in the questions, Christy, with communication, right? How do we go about communicating risk? How do we gain that understanding of being proactive in the organization? I think those are definitely struggles. But with your second question about communication, it's not a one size fits all approach, nor is it a one point in time. We learned yesterday that in one of the sessions that, as adult learners, we only remember 20%, right, of an, or 20 minutes of an hour presentation. So we need to make sure that we're repetitive. I really love one point lessons, as well as creating a diverse approach where we have multiple ways. Some people are read and writers, some people are visual. So how do you make sure that you incorporate all those different learning techniques? Something we do in our training sessions as well to reinforce, everyone's competency as we understand these, as well as communicating when we have a risk and what we did about it. I think sometimes we do that wrong in the industry where we address it, close it as an internal team, and then we move on. We don't properly go out and communicate. Well, hey, we had that customer complaint or that product withdrawal or hold. This is what we found out. This is what we did about it. Really engaging the workforce so they can become more risk aware.
Mm-hmm. Very good point. Very good point. And then, I always tie it back to the plan, do, check, act cycle, right? You implemented this and you determined that it's effective, but does it continue to be effective? So you go back to your plan, do, check, act cycle, and you're saying, is this still effective? Is this working? And we talked about in the training session I did yesterday is that learning curve, that learning drop-off curve, over time. And that's why coaching helps is, everybody starts out with good intentions, but then it just kind of drops off over time, as something else becomes important. So, just cycling back to say, is this still working? Is this still effective? Are people getting the message? Do they realize it's still important? So communication ties right into that perfectly. Do we have the results of our poll to pop up there? Let's go ahead and do that. Yeah, all right, fantastic. Denise, do you want to talk to this?
Yeah, let's see here. We've definitely have a big one, team involvement and buy-in in the process. So we should definitely talk more about that, as well as understand the significance of the risk. Hopefully you guys have seen some of the tools we provided you today to be able to put those into your toolbox. You can use different approaches, even things like root cause analysis, 5 whys. Those are a great way to understand whether a risk exists. Develop controls. Yes, that's the burden. If we do have a significant risk, it's about identifying controls, but don't just identify one control. If we know allergen labeling still continues to be a challenge in the industry, we want to create multiple hurdles. We want to make sure the R&D team knows when they change a raw material, develop a new product, to that purchasing person, receiving, they're all communicated. We have different stop gaps to prevent ultimately that incorrect product being put into the wrong label, as well as just the implementation process goes into creating that risk aware culture. So that team involvement and buy-in, start small and start building it out. We're not successful when we're overwhelmed with, a lot of information. So maybe have core working groups on particular risks that are of significance in your organization. We really want to break it down, have different members involved, get their buy-in.
All right. Thank you all so much for weighing in on that. Good to know. Good to know where your head's at. So Margaret's asking, do we need risk assessments developed aside from your HACCP plan? And Margaret realizes that you do need a risk assessment as part of your HACCP plan, but you did talk a little bit about this, Denise. And so I thought maybe it's a good opportunity to kind of review what you did talk about.
Yeah, I pulled out just a few of those risk assessments in action, right? Those things that are ones we might struggle with, especially some of the new risk analysis requirements around that pipe and ductwork, and taking a look at those elements. So you could do what I do, is you could do Control F into your code and see where the word risk pops up. And if it pops up, put a risk assessment in place. But also, it is about understanding your own product, your own process and facility, and know that you might have a more significant risk in an area, say a ready-to-eat product, than perhaps a not ready-to-eat. There's going to be different unbalanced approaches, and that's why really it's up to you guys to make that determination and to prove to your auditor that you have looked at it, you've understood it, you've discussed it as a team, you've developed plans in place, and you are controlling those hazards outside of just your food safety plan. It's the food safety system all working together as that interconnected code.
Yep, exactly. And that's why we call this unlocking the key to the SQF code, is because it is a risk-based standard. And essentially, we have the requirements of the code, but from there, it is your product, your process, your food safety plan. So you're looking at what is the risk to your product, unique to your site. And that's why this certification is unique to your product, your process, your site. And so that's why we call this the key to unlocking the success to your SQF program, because you're always assessing that risk relative to your product, process, and site. So Margaret, hopefully that helps you out in terms of understanding, risk is woven throughout this standard. And the one that we get often at SQF is the one that Denise brought up, and it's uniform, something as simple as uniforms. And I think too here of what I have on with all of these buttons. Now, would you have this outfit in your plant?
Wow.
And there's look at this. If there's these little tiny, is this a uniform that you would wear in your plant? And my earrings, what's the big deal? They're secure here, they're secure here. What's the risk? But uniforms was one of the ones that we called out in SQF in edition 9, is because we get that question quite often, is how sites ask us, can I have, frocks with buttons or frocks with pockets? And we always turn it back to the site to say, well, you tell me, your product, your process, your site, your employees, your training program, you can tell us whether, or you tell your auditor whether or not you can have a frock with buttons on it, right? Or glasses with little beads on it, or earrings, right? So that's where you're always assessing your risk. Okay.
I think it's a good reminder, Christy, that 2.4.2 on the good manufacturing practices, that particular clause, and Garanka, who's a wonderful trainer, the last conference we were all in person, said that's your magic clause. And I loved that. I stuck with that, because that's where you have the opportunity to write a risk assessment for those very unique situations that exist in your operation. Maybe you're a bakery with a wooden table, and you make very artisan-based product there. Okay, well, tell us what controls you put in place, so I don't have to worry that wood is absorbing water and bacteria or creating a foreign material.
Yes, exactly. And what she's talking about, 2.4.2.1, it's usually pretty consistent across all the codes, but I'm referring to the manufacturing code.
2.2.
Right. Look at Denise has her code 2.4.2.1. It is literally always in front of me. And so that is your way to exempt out of requirements in the GMP module, in your specific module, like module 11. And it says that it can be applied or exempted according to a written risk analysis. And that's what we're talking about here today. Good reminder about that. Thanks, Denise. Yeah. Let's see. We've got a couple of questions here. I'll check here. Okay, fantastic. Hi, if we are a 3PL warehouse and we have a good risk assessment, can we avoid having a no jewelry policy? Well, Denise, I'll let you go ahead and respond to that one.
Yeah, I think that definitely speaks to one of those common questions that we get, very specific situations, and how we need to make sure that we're looking at the intent, which is where are the risks? What are the potential significance if there was a potential earring that fell off or other types of jewelry that could end up causing an issue. So it is absolutely something that you would want to not just have in place, but have a documented risk assessment on.
Right. Again, you tell us, you tell your auditor, you tell your certification body, well, through your risk assessment, we looked at all of this. And we determined that the earrings, the jewelry, the rings, I even look at my false fingernails here, they're just lovely, but they're my favorite thing. But what risk do they pose and how is it controlled? And visitors coming into the site, the people that work in the front of the house and the offices, if they come to the back, are they posing a risk? All of that, how do you address that? Yeah, exactly. And so essentially that's the intent of the code is you're providing that information to support your no jewelry policy. So it's not yes or no, it's you tell us. It's a very good and a very valid question. So gather your data. Okay, I am scrolling down to see some more of these questions that have been popped in there. I think we've got like 3 minutes we can at least do one more. Let us see. Let's see. How do you encourage a risk mindset across all departments? Give us your wisdom on that one, Denise. How do you encourage that risk mindset?
I mean, I think, we tend to put a lot of the burden on the SQF practitioners and now also the substitute practitioners. It's not just us as the technical team that is responsible for overseeing and implementing the code within your organizations. You need to really be able to get that buy-in. You need that senior management support, making sure that our food safety culture is part of that discussion, where the whole purpose of having our food safety culture to be improved is to reduce risk. And if you're not creating an understanding of where the risks are, then how can you truly grow into that positive focus culture where we are reducing that chance of a hazard existing and the recalls or other types of non-conforming events happen? So how can we ultimately encourage this? It is through buy-in. I used to have a gentleman in my team that I knew if I wanted to launch a new program, that I would get his buy-in first, because he would be the most vocal. If he didn't like it, he'd shoot it down. But if he was there to help bring it forth, then he would be my best advocate. So figure out who are your guys out there that are like that, but also who can be your champions. We learned about mentoring yesterday. I thought that was a fabulous presentation about moving on from just peer-to-peer coaching and observations to really finding those mentors, those people that are not ordinary, that they are extraordinary. This will help you to encourage that in those departments. If you struggle with one department, find that winner in there and be able to really help to drive your initiatives.
Yeah, how do you get them to get their buy-in? And we're running out of time, but I have some cool examples of that we often share is, getting the maintenance team on board. Like, how do I have anything to do with food safety? And once you get them on board, sometimes they're the biggest champions. And the folks that do inventorying and purchasing, how do you get them on board? But once you find that one person or that one little key that gets them on board, then they really are the champions. Well, Denise, thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for your excellent questions. Such a great discussion. I love when we get all sorts of passionate questions. Before I throw it back to Rachel, let me remind you to join the post-session chat, which of course is immediately after this session. And you can access it by choosing the breakout tab to the right of me right here above the chat there, and you can access. And if you have some more questions, I'm going to pop in there. And if you would like to further discuss this, you all have your peers in there to further discuss this topic, because it seems like we've got a lot of enthusiasm around it. So one more thank you for Denise. Let's give her some claps in the chat, and I am going to hand it over to Rachel.
Thanks, Christy. And thank you so much, Denise. Hear it up for Denise Webster in the chat, unlocking the secret to SQF. A ton of great takeaways. And honestly, I loved the mindset questions, talking about buy-in, talking about team influence. We are so excited for you to continue the discussion, continue the questions and knowledge sharing in our breakout sessions. Just simply click on breakout. And of course, afterwards, join us for happy hour. Happy hour as our day comes to an end. Let's close it out with some fun, some networking. We've got trivia, escape room, Schlepperdy. We've got bingo. Hey, listen, whatever you want, we've got it. And of course, we're finishing strong tomorrow with day 3. Already the end of conference. So join me 9:15 Eastern. Let's kick off the day together, okay? I think we've become pretty good friends. So let's pump up. Let's get excited. We are future focused. We are together. We're SQF and we're united. See you soon.